I'm Jodie, a relationship and sex therapist based in Southern California, and today we are continuing the Love Island reaction series with season 8, episode 22. We just left off with a recoupling. Casa Amor is no more, and everybody's back at the villa, and we had a recoupling. Of course, on the next episode, regular episode, I'm sure we're gonna hear all of the components of that. But we were due for an after sun after a big explosive episode like that. And we also got to see some unseen footage as well, because they did not show in the regular episode the men choosing in their process. We only saw the women from the villa and their process. One of the patterns that came up and was a discussion on this episode of After Sun was patterns of men sabotaging, losing a lot to get a little. And we kind of hear about this pattern a lot. More specifically, it's related with men. Of course, this is not to say that women don't experience this as well, or people from all diverse backgrounds. I'm sure there are cases, and there's a lot of different factors that come into this. One that gets talked about a lot in general is testosterone, right? And how men are socialized, things like that. Of course, are these probably components? Sure. I know from my work, a lot of the time, I think for many people there is, I talked about this in the last episode, of this kind of like object permanence. So if you're not really familiar with what object permanence is, it's basically like you mostly hear about it with babies. It's why peekaboo is a thing, because babies, when they can't see something, they don't think it's there. So if you hide something, even if you're like, oh, where'd the ball go? And sometimes like even you'll see this with animals too, right? When people are babies, right, you're like, I can hide something, and the baby, because they can't see it, doesn't know that it's there. That's something that develops as our brain progresses. And so this idea of object permanence, which I used this as an example in the last episode of like where Corbin had said, I didn't even think about Kenzie. Kenzie's not right in front of his face, right? Did I even think about her? Or was I like, oh, shiny new toy, here's something else, I'm not even thinking about it, right? Is that thing able to still hold space, which is why we call it object permanence, right? Does it remain there even if it's not there with you? And so I think this comes up a lot more with men. I think one reason that it comes up is because of how we're socialized. Women in general are socialized to feel their emotions a little bit more. That doesn't mean that it's always a positive experience, because then we get gaslit into like, oh, you're too emotional, oh my god. But there is a component where women are a little more used to kind of hearing and talking about emotions, and it's not as stigmatized to be experiencing your emotions or talking about them. And that doesn't mean like, I know I'm a woman who can be very walled up. I was talking about this with somebody the other day, like it takes me a lot to even cry. You'll get anger, you'll get shut down, you'll get almost everything before that. It wasn't always safe for me, or isn't in my personality, to express a lot of more vulnerable emotions like that, like sadness and hurt, right? You're going to get every other defense mechanism there is probably before you get that. But there is this component where men more in particular are not encouraged to do these things. I think this has been changing a little bit with recent generations, but it's still something that exists. And so I think this is a component where they don't always know how to deal with their feelings, or they get too caught up in the moment. There's a lot of reactivity. You know, we kind of saw this in some of the episodes where it was like, okay, how are they responding when the women didn't do what they wanted? Like, I think that's an example of there's not always a lot of like emotional maturity or how to deal with negative feelings that isn't just going to set things on fire. And so I think that that is a component of this, where there isn't a great ability to manage impulses, to kind of pause, and it's just reactive. I wanted to do it, I felt like doing it, I did it. Not, I'm gonna pause, and even though I want to do it, I'm tempted, I'm gonna think about all the things this is gonna cost me. It's almost more of a kind of act and apologize later kind of mindset, right? Of like, well, we'll see what happens. And sadly, this is something that a lot of men tend to come into my office for, because they get in trouble for stuff. You know, they got caught doing something they weren't supposed to, they cheated. Not to say this doesn't exist with women, it totally does as well. But there does tend to sometimes be a little bit of a difference, or at least even with my practice, what I've seen is they will come in more often for these kind of things. Women cheat as well, but there's oftentimes a difference, not always, but sometimes it's women cheat because they're already kind of over some of the things that have happened with their male partners. And so these are just, again, some general patterns that I tend to see. And I do think that they, you know, they have some weight, right? If you're seeing something over and over again, you're like, What's that about? You want to take into consideration all these different variables, but of course, you always want to be like, is it that much? We talked about this again with like, hey, does just because people are moving physically fast in their relationship, does that mean that this isn't a viable relationship? No. But am I going to be surprised when their relationship didn't work out? Also no. So again, it's not cause and effect, but there are some things that kind of float close to each other. You know, they were talking about this experience, and it was definitely something you saw on the show, right? A lot of the men, I think that's kind of why they chose to air the men going into Casa to the women, because they kind of knew the men are going to be some people that are acting up a little bit. Would the women not have gotten into it? Sure, they would have, but probably wouldn't have been responding the same way as the men did. Were they going to respond with like basically drooling and like Kenzie who and like some of these other things, like I'm in trouble? I feel like sadly that was just, I think I talked about it previously, it's just sometimes like bro behavior. How am I acting with my guy friends, and is that something, if came to light, something that would cause problems? Again, it's the same idea of like when people interact on social media and they think they're anonymous. I'm gonna act out a little bit more. I'm gonna say those meaner things. I'm gonna act a little bit more like a jerk online where I don't feel like those repercussions are gonna come back. The sad part is they didn't know that they were being recorded. Everything that they were doing in Casa was gonna come out. To be honest, I don't even think they were thinking about that. I don't necessarily know if it would have changed things. Again, I think it's more of a, well, let's just see what happens. I'm in the moment and I'll deal with the consequences later. So definitely a lot of fallout. Of course, as you saw from the recoupling, you're like, oh, okay, the girls, a lot of them had hope of, well, maybe he just was having fun, but he's going to come back to me. And of course, for some of them, that was not the case. Some of them it was, and they're going to have to deal with that. But some of them, they did not come back. And so the women then, you know, more of the anger came up again and hurt. We did see the unseen footage, right, of the guys choosing, which I said in the beginning. Nothing crazy there. One of the things that was the most shocking, but at the same time, not so shocking, as there has been a pattern of this behavior, was Sincere telling Amora that if they had more time, that it would have been her. I'm like, what are you saying, man? Oh my, I could not. I'm not shocked by Sincere's behavior at this point, but I was like, so, but if you wanted her, you could have chose her, and how do you think Melanie's gonna feel? And again, okay, a side note on this topic. There is this thing, this fantasy that a lot of people have of, hey, like I found my one person and they were the person I was always meant to be with. We love this idea of the one, right? There's this one person that you're spiritually and universally connected to, and your whole life mission is to find this person. And yes, it's very romantic. People love to believe those things, and I'm not here to say that it's necessarily wrong. But one of the things that's very uncomfortable for people is that there are many right people potentially, and sometimes it's just the timing that you met them. So I don't necessarily think that Sincere was wrong in what he said. There's a potential that maybe if they met at the same time, they had the same process with each other, that maybe he would have chosen Amora. The thing was, he really shouldn't have said that, and he probably shouldn't have said it to her as he was separating from her. This was just something where I'm like, oh, Sincere stepped in it again. That's gonna come out. It's gonna feel like shit. Amora, of course, is gonna be like, but then you're not choosing me. Like, what? It's something that I think he meant to say as comforting, and maybe he was honest about it, but let's just zip it. Like, it's just, I know that's gonna blow up in his face, and we'll see what happens, but disaster. We got to see a little bit more about Casey's choice, and again, I think a lot of people understood why Casey was choosing that. You know, him and Anaya were having some issues. She was feeling insecure. There was some things that maybe weren't a good fit there. There were a little bit of some similar things with him and TT too that kind of felt similar. Sure, he has the right to make his own decision, but it was really sad because I think even him, you know, Casey was kind of hoping that Anaya would choose somebody else. That way he's kind of like off the hook, you know, and she's distracted and he's not going to get the full weight of this recoupling and kind of having to walk in with this other girl. But it was kind of sad that they were talking about how like they really wish that Anaya had chose Carl, and I felt the same way. Then they brought on Sydney and Amora. Amora was talking about how she was really interested in Caleb and Bryce, but then got pulled into Sincere, which was really interesting. And then yeah, there was just some kind of chatting, and of course we had the whole thing where like, oh, they start making out and stuff like that. But I didn't really have too much more to comment on. I think what Carl Carl and Sydney ended up making out or something. Sure, you know, we gotta have some of those kind of things going on the show. So I believe there was four men that left the villa and 2 women. So we're gonna find out shortly, like supposedly, like they said in the last episode, like somebody's gonna be coming back from each. And so how are they gonna kind of determine that? Which I believe is an America vote kind of thing. So how they're going to reveal it, who's it gonna be, we're not gonna know yet, but I'm gonna stay tuned. I'll see you in the next episode.